Hi and welcome to this video in the QPSMR CATI up and running series. And in this video we're going to take you through some of the basics of QPSMR CATI, but also let's have a refresher, if you like, on where you need to be before you actually embark on looking at these videos. Now the files used in this particular video you'll find in video 49, and let's just sort of have a refresher of where we need to be before we actually watch this video. So this video assumes that you're already familiar with setting up a questionnaire in QPSMR. So the sort of things I'm thinking of here is you should be able to do things like perhaps randomize the order of questions, randomize the order of codes, perform checks on your data, know how to set up and handle an open-ended question, know how to display interviewer text. So you really need to be familiar with all the basics of setting up a questionnaire, or certainly all the tools that you're going to use in a CATI questionnaire. And you'll find videos on all these subjects in the QPSMR Insight up and running series, or the QPSMR Companion up and running series, or in the going deeper or digging deeper series that we have for QPSMR as well. So you really should have been through you should know all the tools already that you need to use in setting up a questionnaire. This is really focusing on what you need to do to extend that knowledge into handling a CATI project proficiently. Now, one of the things covered in one of the videos was ZZZ entries, or triple Z entries as they're known. Some of those were we only looked in that video at the ones relevant to a paper questionnaire or a CAPI questionnaire. So there will be some ZZZ entries here that we'll be discussing which are just relevant to CATI surveys. So we'll be extending that knowledge, if you like, in the course of this video. As for whether you're using QPSMR Insight or QPSMR Companion, that doesn't really matter because the principles are exactly the same. It really is a case of whichever tool you prefer to use. So if you're just familiar with Insight, you might continue to set up your questionnaires in that. If you're more familiar with Companion, you would probably set up your questionnaire in that particular tool. So let's look at what you need to do then in the basic sort of sense to get from what you might call a series of questions in a questionnaire to a QDF that contains all the things you need to perform a CATI survey. So I'm going to look at how a QPSMR CATI survey works, because some people may not be familiar with that, and it may be something that's different to other softwares. Indeed, most other CATI systems don't quite work in the same way, as I hopefully will be able to spell out here. So the usual way a CATI survey works is that you have a sample file, and in that sample file will be a series of contacts that you have telephone numbers for, and you may have other details about the respondents. You may know their gender, their age. Any other information about them may be also contained in that sample file, or it just may be literally a list of phone numbers. And the way that QPSMR CATI works is that a record in the sample file, or records in the sample file, are distributed one at a time to the interviewers that you have. Now in this example we've got 6 interviewers, and certainly this PowerPoint slide gives the impression that they're distributed simultaneously. They'll actually be one sample record will be delivered to an interviewer when that interviewer requests a new record. So it's not simultaneous, it'll just be as and when an interviewer needs a new sample record. And that puts quite a light load on the server, so that the only time an interviewer connects with a server is to get a new record to do a survey on, and then to send it back at the end when that record's completed, regardless of the fact whether that was a completed interview or not. When an interviewer has finished with a record in the sample file, the record will go either to C, the completed file, P, the partial file, or F, what we'll call a failed file. Although that's not a physical file, that's just a temporary place that it does within or stores it within the system. Where does it go from there? Well, then it's transferred either back to the sample file. So if it's a failed record because perhaps the respondent wasn't answering the phone at that time, or the respondent asked to call back the next day for some reason, that would be returned to the sample file rather than being a failed record because perhaps the number didn't exist or the respondent refused to take part in the survey. Similarly, with a partial interview, a respondent could stop halfway through a survey and say, well, actually, I'm too busy to finish this now. Could I complete the survey at 8 o'clock tomorrow? And it would be handed back to be finished later at a later stage. So the supervisor effectively sits between the interviewers and the server, and the supervisor can manage things like sample quotas, produce reports on data to see how progress is going, to look at perhaps how many interviews are completed, to check that quotas aren't getting used up and they might need to refresh the sample file to get enough for a particular quota, to run reports on productivity and so on. So the supervisor sort of sits in the middle there and can do all these things, as well as actually conducting interviews if the supervisor wishes to. But those sorts of topics like handling sample and quotas are going to be covered in a separate video. In this video, we're only going to go as far as putting a basic questionnaire together. The difference between QPSMR CATI and other CATI products is that the interviewer only interacts with the server at the beginning and the end of the interview. So effectively, the interviewer gets a record from the sample file, then works locally on their own station during the course of the interview, and then only returns it at the end. And of course, that might be immediately. They might get a sample record and it might fail because the number doesn't exist, or the person might be out or asked to be called at another time, or it may be a completed interview that gets right to the end and be saved as a complete interview. Now, most other products don't work this way. Most other products are fetching a question at a time from the server, which can cause some problems, because if you've got that sort of scenario, it will mean that there's a bigger load on the server and cheaper hardware will not work. So this is quite important, that QPSMR CATI puts a very low load on the server because it's only interacting with the server at the beginning and the end. All right, let's go back now to look at actually the sort of framework of a CATI QDF. And where I'm going to start for this part of the demonstration is to point you towards some very useful files that you can either download or you'll actually find in the files with this video. And these are some skeleton questionnaires which will help you set up a CATI questionnaire, because it has a lot more controls than, say, a paper questionnaire. And the one I would start with, if you've got sample, is the skeleton CATI with sample QDF. If you've got no sample, this one would do. There is also another one, a special one, which we won't cover in this video particularly, where you can use WinSock, and that's for automatic dialing or predictive dialing, if you've got that sort of setup in place. So let's open up this questionnaire here. I'm going to actually use the classic version here. And here's a skeleton questionnaire which looks very unfamiliar. It's not full of questions. It's full of mainly ZZ entries, and we're going to look at that in a little while. And while I'm here, I'm going to also open up new project.qdf. Let's open that up. And this looks much more like a normal questionnaire. You can see we've got some questions down here, and it looks rather like a paper survey or a CAPI survey that might be conducted, where you're just really collecting the barest of information. You'll see at the beginning here, there's some questions that pick up some information, and you can see in brackets here they've all got from sample. So you can perhaps imagine that this is information that's in my sample file. So we might know the name of the respondent, 3 lines of their address, their postcode, whether they're a member of the organisation that we're interviewing on behalf of, whether they attended an event. So we've got some information on our sample file besides our telephone number, name, address 123, postcode, and whether they're a member. And this is an event as well, sorry. And here's the questions in the questionnaire. These questions here, 13 questions, a mixture of filters and various other features that you might want to use, a check statement to check in here that the total of these figures equals 100%, and so on. So what you might call a typical questionnaire. And of course, as I said at the beginning, you really should be familiar with all these tools that are used in setting up the questionnaire and its structure before really embarking on a CATI survey. And as I say, there's sporting videos for pretty much all the features that you would want in the flow of a questionnaire in our other videos. So let's now go back to the CATI skeleton questionnaire. Here it is. And let's have a look at this. Now, in a separate video, I covered the topic of what ZZ entries were, and hopefully that gave a very good framework for understanding the purpose of ZZ entries. But I didn't cover the ones that were specifically concerned with CATI interviews. So let's go into the help and have a quick look at those. And if we search for ZZZ and scroll down, we'll find here is a list, and I went through all these in a previous video on ZZ entries, but I stopped at the point that it went on to the CATI topics down here. So you can see here there's a list of ZZZ entries that apply only to CATI interviews, because things like setting an appointment are really not relevant to a paper survey. And you can see the ZZ entries here. There's ATM, which sets an appointment time, and that would be stored in the format HHMMSS. So that's the first one. Oh, I missed the date one here before it, CATI appointment date, which is set in the format of YYYMMDD. You're allowed to have short comments and long comments made by interviewers. So if in the course of an interview, the interviewer wants to communicate something about a respondent, maybe a respondent was difficult or requested some perhaps particular way of being dealt with, or perhaps it might be something like hard of hearing, so would need the interviewer to perhaps speak up a little bit louder or more clearly. Those sorts of comments can be added by an interviewer and are stored with the record, so that if there's a callback perhaps on a subsequent day or at a later time, that information is conveyed to the next telephone interviewer or set as a reminder if it's the same interviewer. The delay in the appointment time, but you might set that to 5 minutes, so you might be asked to call back at 10:30 on the next day, but you could set a delay there of 5 minutes so that if they call back at 10:35, that would be quite acceptable. There's another ZZ entry here, which records the last question name that was asked. So let's say an interview is interrupted because the person being interviewed says, actually, I'd like to stop now and finish this at 10 o'clock tomorrow. The system would need to know that the last question asked was question 5, for example, so that on the next interview, it would automatically restart at question 6 rather than try to start at the beginning. And if we go down here, you'll see there's more things such as the appointment priority, which we'll cover that in a later video. The quota failed entry, where the quota failed, so you know where they failed if there's a quota control at the beginning of the survey. The sample status, which we'll look at when we come to that a little bit later. The ZZZ STR is the number of times that someone's been called, so that's just going to keep incrementing so that you know how many times someone's been called, and maybe that's 5 or something like that, so that information is available. The number of tries today, the SR0, and you'll see down here that these ones here have multiple entries, so they go ZZZ SR0, and down here you'll see the ZZZ SR1 to 9, and likewise for DT, TM and UN. And what these record are the date, time, and outcome, and the last user, last telephone interviewer. For SSR 0 means the last attempt, and 1 to 9 will record the previous up to 9 attempts. So ZZZ SR 0 would recall the result of the last call, and DT0 the date of the last call, and TM0 with the time of the last call, and UN0 the last person. And then SR1 would recall the outcome of the previous call, and so on up to 9 previous calls. UNF, appointment windows login user, so that's who made the appointment and so on, and this is also enabling you to use a CSV file for that. All right, so the other ZZ entries though also will be used in a CATI interview, and they'll be the same as the ones that we covered in the specific video on ZZZ, which also showed you how to input a ZZZ entry and indeed amend a ZZZ entry. All right, so let's return now to our skeleton questionnaire, and here it is. And I draw your attention really to some sort of sections. You'll see you've got these TTT sections in here, and they indicate sections of your questionnaire or parts of the survey which are relevant to different aspects of the CATI interview. So you'll see, for example, down here we get into probably the nub of the survey down here, but you can see in here that between TTT sample, I'll just widen that so it can be seen more clearly. So between TTT sample start and TTT sample end, we need to input any entries that are relevant to the sample or come from the sample file. So if we go back to our questionnaire over here, you may recall we had these fields here that all came from the sample file. So it wouldn't be surprising if I was to copy those from my project and place those in here. And paste those in the relevant place. So now I've got in my sample area of the program here, I've got the telephone number, which I have to have, the name, address, and all that information. And that information will automatically get pulled through from the sample file. And we'll see that in action on a video that covers handling sample files in a bit more detail. Now we're going to be looking at the questionnaire itself, and you'll see down here there's a TT start questionnaire and a TT end questionnaire. And so in here I would go and paste my questions of my questionnaire, the real questions I want to ask. Let's go into that section there. Let's pick the questions I want, project, copy entry, go back to my skeleton questionnaire and paste them into here. And now I've got my questionnaire. And now, and I might have done this first, I would save this as my full questionnaire.qdf. And so in full questionnaire.qdf now, I've got the information that I'm going to be taking off the sample file in here, between TT start sample start and TTT sample end, and I've got my questions between TT start Q and, if I scroll down here, TT end Q. And now if we look at the ZZ entries, they're going to reflect the things that I discussed when I was looking at the help there just now on the ZZZ file. So you'll see that you get the session time and date, and here's where I was referring to the outcome. So if we look at, for example, we got the date and time of the latest call, and you'll note these are working in reverse order, so it's right to have the 0 as the last of the entries and the 9th recall, or the 9th longest to go data at the beginning. That's the way it works. Now, if you only wanted to do 5 callbacks maximum, you might just delete those and take those out your questionnaire. And if you wanted that on every project, you didn't want to do perhaps call anybody back more than 5 times, you might decide to take that out the skeleton questionnaire. You haven't got to have all the entries that are in the skeleton questionnaire. If there's any information here that you don't want, you can just delete it. So this is what you might call a full skeleton questionnaire. But if you don't, for example, want to record the number of keystrokes, you can just delete that entry and that information wouldn't get stored. If we look at the ZZZSR0, you'll see that it's got 16 responses, and you can add what responses you want here or change it. The only one that must be kept as it is the 01, the interview proceed, because that has a special meaning to the whole CATI system. But all of these other outcomes here can be either grouped together as one or can be added to whatever you like. You can have 20 outcomes, or you can cut that down to 4. If you're not interested in it being a noisy line particularly, you might want to group that with something else in like that seemed appropriate to you for the reason for a failed call. Now, of course, all of those outcomes should be the same for each of these. So again, if you were going to change the 16 outcomes that comes in the skeleton QDF to maybe perhaps just 8 outcomes, you would obviously change your skeleton if you wanted that applied to every project so that you hadn't got to edit it each time. But they should all be the same for each, within each questionnaire. They should all have the same number of responses. And at the end here, I'm not going to go through all of this. You can again control this. So the end here records the final outcome. And here we get 5 outcomes: successful, out of quota, not eligible, aborted, and partial. You don't change those typically, but because of that, you can, if we just widen this, you can see this, you can have different information recorded here. So you can say that, okay, I want to store this particular piece of information here so that if it has the condition FEND was, the message that we give to the respondent at the end is, that concludes the interview. Thank you for your time. Goodbye. Whereas if they had a partial interview, you might want to say, thank you for your help so far. As agreed, we will call you again. And you could pull in there using piping the date and time that you're going to call them with goodbye for now. And of course, it goes without saying that all these question texts here you can change. So if you didn't want it to say that concludes the questionnaire, thank you for your time, goodbye, but you wanted to say something different to that you thought was perhaps more appropriate, or indeed in a different language, you can just edit the text for the question, and that would be what the interviewer sees and what they reads out. And finally here, there's a variable that's been constructed with a status that has 8 outcomes in it. So it's actually doing some sort of clever calculations here to look at different people, like fresh sample, not called, live, and so on. And again, you could add to that variable if you wanted to get that some finer granularity on that, which would mean that if you did that, that data would be in the data automatically, and a supervisor, for example, could produce some other analyses or reports. And there's a separate section or a separate video on managing projects, and that includes the supervisor function, where we can look at those sorts of things and what the interviewer can do. So it's worth finding your way around this CATI skeleton questionnaire, looking at all the things there, perhaps trying to make it general purpose so it can be used on any project. Considering all the things that are being recorded, you may decide just to leave it as it is because it has got everything in it that you probably need. But it's also maybe some things that you don't want in there, that you don't want to record, or for perhaps other reasons you don't feel as though you would want to record. So that completes this opening video on the sort of introduction to handling a CATI project. I would encourage you to make sure that you know how to set up your questionnaires by looking at the videos in the QPSMR Insight and Companion videos. But that completes this video for now. I hope it was useful to you. You'll find other videos on other aspects of QPSMR CATI in this series as well. Thank you.